The tension in the grand auction house suffocated the air like an invisible fog, as the magnificent brown stallion stood motionless in the center ring, his coat gleaming under harsh spotlights that exposed every muscle tensed beneath his skin. The small white patch on his chest seemed to glow against his rich mahogany coat, but it was his eyes that captivated everyone, dark pools reflecting something beyond ordinary equine weariness. The crowd of wealthy buyers shifted in their polished leather seats, auction catalogs rustling as they assessed the animal with the cold calculation of investors, rather than the reverence he deserved. The auctioneer's voice rang out with practiced enthusiasm, his words bouncing off wooden beams as he lauded bloodlines and potential, but the horse remained eerily still, as if gathering energy from some hidden reservoir deep within. When the auctioneer stepped forward, something changed in the stallion's demeanor. A ripple of movement, starting at his withers and traveling down his powerful frame like an electric current. The shift was subtle at first, so slight that only those who truly understood horses noticed the warning signs. The flick of an ear, the widening of nostrils, the almost imperceptible shift of weight to his back legs. Then it happened. The stallion exploded into motion with such violence that the metal gates rattled and groaned against their hinges. His forelegs slashed at the air, hooves whistling mere inches from the auctioneer's face. As the man stumbled backward, his composure shattered. The stallion's scream pierced the shocked silence, not a sound of fear but of rage, raw and primal. People scattered in panic, expensive suits brushing against designer dresses as they scrambled toward exits. Security guards rushed forward with catch poles, their movements hesitant, uncertain against such untamed fury. Through the chaos, a single figure remained still at the back of the auction house. A weathered man with eyes as sharp as winter frost watched the scene unfold with something more than curiosity. His calloused hands gripped the wooden railing, knuckles white with tension as the stallion continued his violent protest against invisible demons. While others saw only danger, this observer saw something different. Something haunting in the way the horse fought not against the men surrounding him, but against memories etched into his very being. The truth hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. This wasn't just an untamed spirit. This was a horse carrying secrets dark enough to drive him to desperate fury, secrets someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Mason Reeves held his breath as the chaos unfolded before him, his weathered hands gripping the auction catalog with white knuckles, while everyone else scrambled toward the exits. The violent display had emptied the once crowded auction house, leaving behind only the bravest attendees and those paid enough to stay. Mason remained rooted in place, his eyes never leaving the heaving flanks of the wild-eyed stallion, as handlers struggled with catch poles and tranquilizers. Something about this horse called to him on a level beyond reason, beyond logic, a silent recognition that transcended the pandemonium surrounding them. The auctioneer, his face now pale and shaken, attempted to restore order with nervous taps of his gavel. His voice wavered as he announced they would proceed with bidding. Despite the incident, though his eyes darted repeatedly toward the horse as if expecting another explosion, security personnel positioned themselves strategically around the ring, their tense postures betraying fear despite professional facades. The starting bid dropped dramatically from the original asking price, yet still no paddles rose. No one wanted the liability, the danger, the broken spirit that had just demonstrated such terrifying power. Mason felt a strange calmness wash over him as he slowly raised his paddle. The motion drew startled glances and hushed whispers across the remaining audience. A ranch hand nearby muttered warnings about foolish decisions and death wishes, but Mason barely registered the words. The auctioneer called his bid with surprise, paused for competition that never came, and reluctantly brought down the gavel with finality that echoed through the tense silence. As handlers prepared to move the horse to temporary holding, Mason approached the ring with slow, deliberate steps. The stallion's ears swiveled toward him, tracking his movement with intense focus different from the blind panic displayed earlier. There was assessment in those eyes now, calculation rather than mere fear. When Mason stopped at the gate, The horse's nostrils flared, drawing in his scent with deep, measured breaths. The stallion's muscles remained tense, coiled with potential energy, but the violent trembling had ceased. One of the handlers began explaining protocols for dangerous animals, listing special requirements for transport and warning of legal liability. But Mason hardly heard him. His attention remained fixed on the subtle shift in the brown stallion's demeanor, how his ears had stopped pinning flat against his skull, how his breathing had steadied to something approaching normal. It wasn't trust, not yet, but perhaps recognition of something kindred. Mason understood broken things, knew the language of trauma, written in scars both visible and hidden. As their eyes met across the sawdust-covered ring, an unspoken agreement passed between man and horse. Whatever darkness had brought them to this moment would no longer remain buried. The wind carried whispers across Mason's property as the trailer rattled down the gravel driveway, the stallion inside shifting restlessly with each bump and turn of the wheels. Mason's modest ranch sprawled before them, nothing like the pristine facilities the horse likely came from, just weathered fences, a sturdy barn with peeling paint, and open pastures stretching toward distant hills. When Mason finally opened the trailer door, the stallion remained inside, nostrils flaring as he assessed this unfamiliar territory. His muscles rippled beneath his mahogany coat, poised between flight and fight, eyes scanning for threats that existed only in his memory. For 3 days the horse refused to leave the trailer. Mason brought water, left hay, and simply waited, understanding that forced compliance would only deepen whatever wounds this creature carried. On the 4th morning, Mason found the trailer empty, the stallion standing at the far corner of the paddock, his stance alert but no longer trembling with barely contained panic. It was the first small victory in what promised to be a long campaign. Mason named him Tempest, fitting for a spirit that seemed to shift like storm clouds, unpredictable and powerful. Some mornings Tempest would charge the fence when Mason approached, teeth bared and ears pinned flat against his skull. Other days he would stand quietly, watching Mason with an intensity that felt like recognition, allowing him to come within a few yards before retreating. These inconsistencies weren't random, but triggered by patterns Mason couldn't yet decipher, certain sounds, movements, or even the color of clothing Mason wore. Word spread quickly through the small ranching community about Mason's new acquisition. Dale Winters, whose property bordered Mason's on the east, leaned against the fence one evening, his weathered face creased with concern. As he watched Tempest pace, he spoke of rumors surrounding a horse matching Tempest's description, whispers about a training facility where methods crossed the line from discipline to cruelty, about a stallion who had witnessed something that made him too dangerous to keep, but too valuable to destroy. More visitors came in the following days, each bringing fragments of stories, warnings wrapped in concerned glances. They spoke of Blackwood stables with lowered voices, of horses pushed beyond breaking points for prestige and profit. A retired veterinarian studied Tempest from a distance, noting the way he flinched at sudden movements above his head, how he placed himself where he could see all approaches. These weren't just the behaviors of a mistreated animal, she said, but of one carrying memories too dark to process. That night, Mason sat on the porch steps watching Tempest's silhouette against the fading light. When he stood to return inside, Tempest did something unexpected. He walked to the fence, steady and deliberate, and stood quietly watching Mason, not approaching for connection, not retreating in fear, but acknowledging his presence as something separate from whatever shadows haunted him. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first thread of possibility in what had seemed an impenetrable darkness. The dirt road leading to Blackwood stables stretched before Mason like an ominous warning, each mile marker intensifying the unease crawling up his spine. Tempest's registration papers, discovered folded and weather-damaged in the trailer's hidden compartment, had led him here, to a breeding operation whose gleaming reputation concealed shadows darker than anyone dared speak aloud. The property emerged from behind manicured hedges, its pristine white fences and immaculate grounds a stark contrast to the whispered rumors that had followed Mason's inquiries. Blackwood wasn't just any stable, it was racing royalty, producing champions whose bloodlines commanded prices that could buy entire farms. Mason parked his battered truck at the visitor entrance, dust settling around tires that seemed subtly shameful against the polished stone driveway. Security cameras tracked his movement with mechanical precision as he approached the main office. Inside, cool air carried the scent of leather and money, that distinctive fragrance of places where horses were commodities first, living creatures second. A receptionist with a practiced smile greeted him, her eyes assessing his worn jeans and weathered boots with barely concealed judgment. The mention of Tempest's name changed everything. Her smile vanished, replaced by something guarded and cold. Moments later, a door opened, and a man emerged, tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that calculated worth and threat in equal measure. Andrew Blackwood himself, heir to the stable's legacy, extended no hand in greeting as he invited Mason into a private office. The walls displayed trophies and photographs of champions past and present, monuments to victory that somehow felt hollow under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Blackwood's questions were precise, layered with meanings beyond the spoken words. He inquired about Tempest's condition, Mason's intentions, how exactly the paperwork had been discovered. Each query delivered with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to interrogations disguised as conversation. When Mason mentioned the auction, the violent outburst, Blackwood's expression never changed, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly around the pen he held. Mason's own questions received responses so carefully crafted they revealed nothing, while implying everything. Vague references to behavioral issues, training challenges, regrettable decisions made by staff since dismissed. Blackwood offered to buy Tempest back at double the auction price, then triple when Mason hesitated. The offer came with assurances about providing the specialized care such a difficult animal required, delivered with the confidence of someone unaccustomed to refusal. As Mason declined and rose to leave, Blackwood's demeanor shifted subtly. The practiced charm receded like an outgoing tide, revealing something harder beneath. His parting words carried weight beyond their simple arrangement, a warning about the responsibilities of owning difficult horses, about accidents that could befall unprepared handlers, about the legal complications that might arise from pursuing certain inquiries too deeply. Mason left with empty hands but absolute certainty. Whatever Tempest had experienced within these pristine walls had been deliberate, systematic, and worth concealing at any cost. The truth revealed itself like a nightmare, taking form as the former stable hand. Eric spoke in hushed tones across Mason's kitchen table, his fingers trembling against the wooden surface, worn smooth by years of similar conversations that had never carried such weight. The documentation spread between them told a story darker than Mason had imagined. Training logs disguised as standard records, veterinary reports with discrepancies that couldn't be explained by honest mistakes, and photographs Eric had secretly taken before fleeing Blackwood's employment. Each image showed the systematic breaking of horses through methods abandoned by reputable trainers decades ago. Sleep deprivation, food restriction, and devices designed to cause pain without leaving evidence that would raise questions during inspections. Tempest's file was thicker than the others, marked with red notations and cryptic symbols that Eric translated with reluctance, his voice growing quieter with each revelation. The stallion hadn't simply been subjected to the cruel regimen. He had resisted it with a spirit that both frustrated and intrigued. Andrew Blackwood, the breaking of Tempest had become personal for the stable owner, a challenge he refused to lose, even as the methods escalated beyond what the other handlers would tolerate. But the true horror lay in what happened during Tempest's final night at Blackwood, detailed in Eric's shaking words and fragmented notes. Another horse, a promising mare whose temperament had proven equally difficult to subdue, had been brought to the same isolated training barn. The session went too far, a miscalculation, an equipment failure, or perhaps deliberate cruelty pushed beyond sustainable limits. While Tempest watched from an adjacent stall, the mare collapsed, her system overwhelmed by stress and exhaustion. No veterinarian was called, no report was filed. By morning, all traces of her existence had been erased from Blackwood's records, her body removed under cover of darkness. Tempest had been the only witness to a death that officially never occurred. His subsequent behavior, unpredictable, violent, when cornered, panicked at certain triggers, suddenly made perfect sense. The stallion wasn't dangerous. He was traumatized, carrying memories that his human handlers dismissed as impossible for an animal to process. Blackwood hadn't sold Tempest because he was untrainable. They had discarded him because he had seen too much. Eric's final revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. The auction where he had found Tempest wasn't chance. It was calculated disposal, arranged through middlemen to distance Blackwood from a horse that had become evidence. Mason's purchase had disrupted a carefully orchestrated disappearance, drawing attention to a narrative Blackwood had worked meticulously to control. The inquiry Mason had made wasn't just unwelcome, it was dangerous, pulling at threads of a deception that, if unraveled completely, would destroy the stable's reputation and possibly lead to criminal charges. As dawn broke across the ranch, casting long shadows through the kitchen windows, Mason knew with grim certainty that his fight to save Tempest had become something far larger than one horse's redemption. It had become about justice hidden too long in darkness. The night crept across Mason's ranch with an unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional warning snort from Tempest, as his ears swiveled toward shadows that seemed to shift with purpose rather than wind. The progress between man and horse had been gradual but undeniable. Tempest now accepting Mason's presence in the paddock, sometimes even approaching with cautious curiosity, his dark eyes carrying questions no human language could answer. But tonight something had changed. Tempest paced the fence line restlessly, muscles bunched beneath his gleaming coat, as if sensing a threat his human companion had yet to perceive. Mason first noticed the unfamiliar vehicle 3 days ago. A black SUV parked on the county road overlooking his property, windows tinted beyond legal limits. It disappeared when Mason drove toward it but returned the following day, joined by another. The warning from Eric had been clear. Blackwood would not allow loose ends, especially ones that could testify to criminal negligence. The phone calls began next. Silence on the line when Mason answered, then cryptic messages about accidents that befall stubborn men and problem horses. Yesterday Mason found his mailbox smashed, a horseshoe nailed to the splintered wood, not a random act of vandalism, but a message only someone from the racing world would understand. The local sheriff had listened to Mason's concerns with thinly veiled skepticism, promising to increase patrols but clearly unconvinced that one of the county's wealthiest property owners would resort to intimidation over a horse sold at public auction. Without evidence beyond Eric's testimony, a former employee with potential grudges, there was little to justify official intervention. Mason had spent the afternoon securing the property as best he could, checking fences, installing motion-activated lights, sleeping in the barn rather than the vulnerable farmhouse. The sound that finally confirmed his fears was subtle, the soft crunch of boots on gravel, trying too hard to be silent. Tempest's warning came next, a low rumbling in his chest, unlike any sound Mason had heard from him before. Through gaps in the barn siding, Mason counted 3 figures moving with practiced coordination, their silhouettes carrying the unmistakable shapes of tranquilizer guns and catch poles. They weren't here to threaten anymore. They had come to reclaim evidence that could destroy Blackwood's stables. With movements born from years of handling unpredictable animals, Mason slipped into Tempest's stall, speaking in low, steady tones as he secured a halter around the stallion's head. The horse trembled beneath his touch, but didn't pull away. Some deeper understanding seeming to pass between them. There would be no defending the property, no stand against men who had already proven their willingness to eliminate obstacles permanently. Their only chance was the narrow trail that wound through the back pasture, disappearing into dense woodland where vehicles couldn't follow. As Mason led Tempest through the rear barn door into the moonless night, a beam of light cut through the darkness behind them. Their window of escape, narrowed to seconds. With one fluid motion, Mason swung onto Tempest's bare back, their first true moment of physical trust forged in desperation rather than training. The stallion tensed, then surged forward into the darkness, carrying them away from immediate danger but toward an uncertain wilderness where man and horse would need to become something more than reluctant allies to survive. The revelation came during their third night in the wilderness, when the moon hung full and heavy above the forest clearing, where Mason had finally allowed himself and Tempest a moment of rest after days of constant movement through unforgiving terrain. The campfire's flickering light painted shadows that danced across Tempest's mahogany coat as Mason tended to the small flame, the crackling sound filling the silence between man and horse with something almost like conversation. Tempest had remained close throughout their journey, displaying a reluctant trust born not from training, but from the primal understanding that they now shared the same fate, pursuers behind them, uncertainty ahead, their survival irrevocably intertwined. When the branch in the fire snapped with a sharp report, Tempest's reaction transcended ordinary equine fear, his body contorted in terror, eyes rolling white as he backed against a tree, trembling violently while making a guttural sound Mason had never heard from any horse. Not a neigh or whinny, but something more elemental, more haunted. The reaction wasn't to the noise itself, but to something it had awakened in the stallion's memory, something buried beneath layers of instinct and survival. Mason approached slowly, his hands empty and visible, speaking words that mattered less than their tone. Steady, calm, anchoring. For long minutes, Tempest remained locked in his panic, seeing not the forest around them, but some horror from his past. Then gradually, as Mason continued his gentle approach, the stallion's breathing steadied, his eyes, though still wary, focused once more on the present, on Mason, on their shared reality, rather than the ghosts that had momentarily possessed him. What followed was a breakthrough neither man nor horse could have anticipated. As Mason gently placed his hand on Tempest's neck, the stallion didn't pull away, but leaned into the touch, his large body shifting with the unmistakable surrender of an animal who had carried a burden alone for too long. Mason stood frozen, recognizing that what passed between them was neither dominance nor submission, but something rarer, witness. Tempest had spent months locked in a nightmare he couldn't communicate, trapped with memories his human handlers dismissed as impossible for a horse to process or retain. But here, away from the constraints of civilization, Mason began to read the language of Tempest's trauma, through its triggers, how the sudden crack of breaking wood sent him into panic, how certain smells or shadows could transform him instantly from calm to terrified. Each reaction was like a fragment of testimony, revealing the truth of what had happened that night at Blackwood Stables more clearly than any human witness could have provided. The mare hadn't simply died from extreme training methods. She had been deliberately sacrificed, her death the result of calculated cruelty masked as discipline. The cracking sound that triggered Tempest wasn't just any noise. It was the specific sound of equipment being deliberately misused, until bones shattered. His fear of corners wasn't random. It was where he had been trapped, forced to watch as evidence was removed, and a crime concealed under cover of darkness. As dawn broke across their makeshift camp, Mason and Tempest stood together at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the mountains that promised temporary refuge. Something fundamental had shifted between them. No longer rescuer and rescued, but allies bound by a shared purpose. Tempest had been a silent witness to atrocity. Now Mason would be his voice. The morning sun cast long shadows across Blackwood Stables as Mason rode Tempest through the main gates, the security cameras swiveling to track their unexpected return. With mechanical precision, the once immaculate grounds seemed different now. The pristine white fences and manicured lawns, no longer symbols of excellence, but facades concealing darker truths that Mason carried in the saddlebag slung across his shoulder. Tempest moved beneath him with newfound confidence, his powerful strides carrying them past staring stable hands and shocked visitor. The stallion that had left these grounds broken and terrified now returned transformed. His head held high, his connection with the man on his back evident in every synchronized movement between them. Andrew Blackwood emerged from the main office, his tailored suit incongruous against the morning dew, his practiced smile faltering as he recognized the rider approaching his private courtyard. Behind him, several men shifted nervously, the same figures who had hunted them through the forest nights before. Mason guided Tempest to a stop, just yards from Blackwood, close enough to see the calculated assessment in the man's eyes as he searched for weaknesses, escape routes, plausible denials. No words needed to be exchanged. Both men understood the gravity of this confrontation. The gathered crowd of trainers, grooms, and visiting buyers sensed the tension crackling between the two men. Conversations dying as attention focused on the unexpected drama unfolding. Mason reached slowly into his saddlebag, extracting a weathered leather folder that contained Eric's evidence, photographs, training logs, veterinary records doctored to conceal abuse, all carefully preserved despite their desperate flight through wilderness. Blackwood's face remained impassive, but his fingers twitched slightly at his sides, betraying the calculation happening behind his calm facade. What Blackwood couldn't have anticipated was Tempest himself. How the horse would react to returning to the place of his trauma. Instead of the panic or aggression that would have discredited Mason's claims, Tempest demonstrated something more damning, specific, targeted recognition. When one of Blackwood's trainers moved forward, Tempest's reaction was immediate and precise. Not generalized fear, but focused identification of someone connected to past abuse. When Mason guided him toward the isolated training barn where the fatal incident had occurred, Tempest's behavior changed again. His breathing quickened, his muscles tensed, but he didn't flee. Instead, he walked deliberately to a specific stall, pawing at the floor where no evidence remained visible to human eyes, but where equine senses still detected traces of what had happened. The spectators followed, drawn by the unfolding drama and the uncanny precision of Tempest's movements. Each reaction corresponded exactly to the documentation in Mason's folder, creating a devastating timeline of systematic cruelty impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Blackwood's carefully constructed reputation unraveled with each step Tempest took, each location he identified, each person he responded to with targeted memory rather than random fear. The horse wasn't just an animal reacting instinctively. He was bearing witness in the only language available to him, his behavior more compelling than any human testimony. When several prominent buyers quietly asked staff to remove their horses from consideration for purchase, Blackwood's composed exterior finally cracked. His voice rose in desperate denial, accusations of trespassing and slander that fell flat against the undeniable evidence before them. As law enforcement vehicles approached the gates, summoned by witnesses who could no longer ignore what they were seeing, Mason leaned forward to stroke Tempest's neck. The battle wasn't over. Powerful interests would resist change. Money would attempt to bury truth. But in this moment, the silent witness had finally been heard. The transformation of Blackwood stables unfolded like the changing seasons, justice arriving not in a single dramatic moment, but through persistent waves that gradually washed away decades of corruption and cruelty. The investigation that began with Tempest's testimony branched outward, exposing a network of fraudulent practices that had poisoned the prestigious racing world. Blackwood's empire crumbled, not from the outside, but from within, as trainers came forward with their own accounts, each revelation validating what Tempest had shown them that pivotal day. Mason watched from a distance as the man who had built his fortune on broken spirits was led away in handcuffs, his perfectly tailored suit replaced by the uniform of consequence. The rolling hills that had once housed champions, bred through fear, now breathed with different purpose. Mason had used the settlement money from the case to purchase the property, transforming the isolated training barns into open, sun-filled spaces where horses moved freely. Wire fences replaced the pristine white ones, less beautiful perhaps, but more honest in their intention. not to showcase wealth but to provide safety without confinement. Horses arrived weekly, their bodies bearing the visible and invisible scars of human ambition gone too far, their spirits requiring the patient restoration that only time and genuine care could provide. Tempest remained the heart of the sanctuary, his transformation from terrified victim to confident guide, astonishing even Mason, the stallion who once trembled at human touch, now approached new arrivals with gentle curiosity, his presence somehow communicating understanding that transcended species. Veterinarians who visited spoke of it in scientific terms: prey animals recognizing safety, herd dynamics establishing hierarchy. But Mason saw something deeper in the way Tempest stood beside particularly traumatized newcomers, his body positioned as a living shield between them and perceived threats. On the anniversary of their confrontation at Blackwood, Mason sat on the hillside, watching Tempest lead a group of rehabilitated horses across the pasture, their movements synchronized in that perfect equine harmony that humans could observe, but never fully join. The auction house that had once witnessed Tempest's violent outburst now hosted quarterly adoption events, where carefully screened homes came to offer second chances. Former racehorses, retired show jumpers, and nameless neglected animals found their way to new beginnings, each carrying forward the legacy of one brown stallion who refused to let trauma define his spirit. As evening light painted the sanctuary in gold, Mason understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about creating a future where those wounds became the foundation for something stronger. Tempest approached, pressing his muzzle against Mason's shoulder in that gesture of connection that still humbled him each time it happened. From violent outburst to peaceful sanctuary, their journey reminded everyone who visited that healing begins with one brave step beyond fear. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of horses, rescue and redemption. Your support helps share these important messages of hope and healing with others who need to hear them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.